My boss dared me to take her sister on a date during the company holiday party, half joking, the way bosses do when they've had 2 drinks and decided everyone's love life is their business. I said yes as a joke. Her sister didn't laugh. "Adrian," Priya said, leaning across the table with the specific confidence of someone 2 glasses of wine into a holiday party, "you've been single for as long as I've known you, and I have decided this is now my problem to solve." "That's generous of you. I'm a generous person. Also, I'm your boss, which means my opinions carry weight whether you want them to or not." She pointed across the room to where a woman in a dark green dress was talking to one of the catering staff, with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for actual emergencies. "That's my sister, Hannah. She does interior design, she's allergic to small talk, and she has somehow managed to avoid every man I've tried to introduce her to for the past 2 years. That sounds like a pattern she's chosen deliberately. It's a pattern she needs help breaking." Priya straightened, the specific posture of someone committing fully to a bad idea. "I dare you to ask her out. Right now. Tonight." I should clarify, for context, that Priya Chandra was the founder of the 11-person startup I'd been writing back-end code for over the past 3 years, and that she ran the company with the same chaotic, well-intentioned energy she was currently applying to my romantic life. She was an excellent boss in most respects, sharp, fair, generous with credit when things went well, and an occasional menace in the specific category of believing every problem, including other people's problems, could be solved with sufficient enthusiasm and a direct approach. "I'm not going to ask your sister out because you dared me to at a holiday party," I said. Why not?" "Several reasons. It's weird. She didn't consent to being volunteered, and if it goes badly, I have to keep working for you while you process the awkwardness of having engineered your employee's failed date with your sibling." Priya considered this with more seriousness than the conversation probably warranted. "Fair points. All valid. I'm still daring you. You can't dare someone into asking a stranger out. That's not how dares work." "It's exactly how dares work. That's the whole premise of a dare." She was already standing, already moving, the specific momentum of someone who had decided the conversation was over and the action phase had begun. "Hannah, come here for a second." I had approximately 4 seconds to consider fleeing the holiday party entirely before Hannah Price crossed the room toward us, and by the time she arrived, fleeing was no longer a viable option. "My name is Adrian Foster. I'm 31 years old. I write back-end code for a startup that does logistics software, which means I spend most of my days solving problems that are interesting to approximately 6 people in the world, and explaining them to investors in language that makes them sound more exciting than they technically are. I'm good at my job. I'm less good, by most external assessments including my own, at the parts of life that don't involve a clearly defined problem and a testable solution." Hannah Price arrived at our table with the specific caution of someone who had clearly overheard at least part of what her sister was orchestrating. "What did you do?" she said to Priya. Not really a question. "I didn't do anything. I'm just facilitating an introduction. Adrian, this is my sister Hannah. Hannah, Adrian writes code and has been single for an embarrassingly long time. I think you two should go on a date." Hannah looked at me with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, mortification and the specific dry amusement of someone who had grown up with this particular sister and had developed defenses accordingly. "I'm so sorry," she said to me directly. "She does this. I have asked her not to do this." I gathered. For what it's worth, I told her it was a bad idea about 30 seconds before you arrived. "It is a bad idea. I agree completely." We stood there for a moment in mutual agreement about the badness of the idea, while Priya looked between us with the expression of someone whose plan was not unfolding the way she'd scripted it. "This is going worse than I anticipated," Priya said. "You anticipated us falling instantly into each other's arms because you dared it into existence," Hannah said. "That's not how attraction works. It's not a software function you can trigger on command." "I'm aware it's not a software function. I was hoping for some natural chemistry, that's all." "There's no chemistry happening at a dare. There's just 2 adults being put on the spot." "You're both being difficult," Priya said. You dared an employee to ask out your sister at a company party, Hannah said. I think difficult is a generous description of what you're being. I found myself, against my better judgment, smiling at the exchange. The specific rhythm of siblings who'd clearly had variations of this argument for 30-some years, and had it refined into something almost choreographed. For the record, I said to Hannah, I have no intention of asking you out under these specific circumstances. I think that would be insulting to both of us. Hannah looked at me with renewed interest, like I'd said something unexpected. That's a reasonable position. I try to be reasonable. It's mostly what my job requires. What do you do? Back-end engineering, logistics software. It's about as interesting as it sounds, which is to say, not very, except to me. Something in her expression shifted slightly, not quite warming, but recalibrating, the specific reassessment of someone updating a first impression with new information. I design interiors, she said, mostly residential. It's more interesting than it sounds, except when clients want everything to look like a hotel lobby, which is more often than you'd think. That sounds exhausting. It's a process. She glanced at Priya, who was watching this exchange with poorly concealed delight. This doesn't mean anything, by the way. We're just talking because my sister cornered both of us into an awkward situation, and talking is less awkward than standing in silence. Understood. Purely defensive conversation. Exactly. We talked for another 20 minutes anyway, purely defensively, about nothing in particular. Her work, my work, the specific indignity of company holiday parties designed by committee. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd actually been to one of these parties before, years back when Priya's company was smaller, and recognized a few of the same string lights that apparently got recycled every December, regardless of venue. You've been paying attention to the string lights longer than most people pay attention to anything at these parties, I said. I noticed decor, it's a professional affliction. I once spent an entire wedding mentally redesigning the seating arrangement instead of listening to the toasts. That seems like it would make weddings exhausting. Extremely. I've learned to mostly keep it to myself unless someone specifically asks, which you just did, so this is your fault. I'll take responsibility. Priya eventually wandered off to harass other employees about their own romantic deficiencies, leaving Hannah and me at the table with the conversation having developed its own momentum independent of her original interference. Near the end of the night, Hannah set her wine glass down and looked at me directly. This is going to sound strange, she said, given everything that just happened, but would you want to get coffee sometime? Not because my sister dared you to, because I'd genuinely like to continue this conversation somewhere without an audience. I looked at her for a moment, recalibrating my own assessment of the evening. I would like that, I said. Genuinely, not under duress. Good. Because if you'd said yes just now because Priya was still within earshot, I would have had to assume you were just being polite. She's not within earshot, I checked. Hannah laughed. Short, real, the first unguarded thing I'd seen from her all evening. The coffee happened on a Tuesday, away from the office, away from Priya's orbit entirely, just the two of us at a small place near Hannah's studio that served the kind of coffee that required you to know what you were ordering before you got to the counter. Hannah arrived in work clothes, straight from a client meeting, and ordered with the specific precision of someone who'd thought it through in advance. You look like you have a system, I said. Occupational hazard. When you spend your days making decisions about other people's spaces, you apply the same decisiveness to your own life out of self-defense. She found a table near the window. What about you? Systems, or is that design specific? I write code. Systems are basically the job description. Fair. Though I'd guess code systems are more logical than mine. Clients are less predictable than functions. Functions misbehave too, just less personally. She laughed, quick, real, unguarded, and the ease of it made the rest of the conversation flow more naturally than the careful small talk at the holiday party had. We talked for over an hour, well past the time either of us had probably planned for a first coffee. She told me about a recent client who'd wanted his entire living room to look like a yacht, despite owning no boats and having no apparent connection to maritime life, delivered with the dry exasperation of someone who found her job genuinely interesting, despite its occasional absurdities. I told her about a software bug that had taken 3 days to find and turned out to be a single misplaced semicolon, which she found disproportionately funny for a story about punctuation. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," she said near the end. "Given how we met." Low bar, given how we met. True, but still. I expected this to be awkward, and it mostly hasn't been. Mostly? There was a brief awkward moment when I ordered and you watched me with that much focus. I thought you were judging the syrup pump count. I was admiring the precision. Different thing entirely. Generous interpretation, I'll allow it. She'd left her keys on the table by accident at the end of that first coffee. Not dramatically, just an ordinary oversight. The kind of thing that happens when two people are mid-conversation and not paying attention to the table. I noticed after she'd already left, caught up to her in the parking lot, and held them out. "You left these." "Oh, thank you." I would have noticed eventually, probably around the time I couldn't get into my apartment. Probably inconvenient time to notice. Most inconvenient times are. She took the keys, then paused. "This is going to sound like I'm fishing for a reason to see you again, which, full disclosure, I might be. But I have a meeting near your office on Thursday. Would you want to get lunch?" "I would," I said. "Genuinely, not because you're fishing." "I am absolutely fishing. I know, I'm letting you catch something." She smiled at that. The real one again. The kind I'd started keeping track of without fully admitting I was keeping track. We saw each other twice the following week, 3 times the week after that. The specific acceleration that happens when two people stop pretending the thing developing between them is casual. Hannah was sharper than I'd initially registered at the holiday party, funny in a dry, understated way, with strong opinions about furniture proportions that she delivered with the same seriousness most people reserved for actual important topics. She kept a small swatch of wood in her bag at all times, a habit I noticed on our third coffee, when she pulled it out to compare against the cafe's counter material for reasons that seemed to matter only to her. "What is that?" "Reference sample. White oak. I carry it because clients describe wood tones inconsistently, and I've learned to just show people the actual thing instead of arguing about what warm beige means to different people." She turned it over in her fingers. "It's a professional habit. Mildly absurd outside of work contexts, but it saved me from several arguments." "That's either very practical or very specific." "Both. I contain both qualities." I started noticing, over the following weeks, that she carried this particular swatch into most conversations we had, turning it over while she talked, a fidget that had nothing to do with our conversation, but had become, somehow, a fixed point I associated specifically with her. I had also, by this point, become the unofficial keeper of her office key. This started accidentally. She'd locked herself out of her studio one evening, frustrated and slightly embarrassed about it, and I'd happened to be nearby and had a spare maid at the hardware store 2 days later, mostly so the situation wouldn't repeat itself. She'd protested the gesture as unnecessary. I'd pointed out that it was considerably less unnecessary than her standing locked out of her own studio at 9 in the evening. The key became, after that, a recurring excuse. She'd text that she'd forgotten something inside and ask if I could swing by with the spare. I always could. We both understood, without saying so directly, that the key had become less about practical necessity and more about a reliable reason to see each other on short notice, a kind of unofficial infrastructure for whatever we were quietly building. One evening, about 3 weeks in, she texted asking me to bring the key by because she'd locked herself out, except her own key was sitting visibly on the studio's front step when I arrived, clearly not actually lost. "You have your key right there," I said. Hannah looked at it, then at me, caught and deciding not to bother denying it. "I wanted an excuse to see you tonight." It felt more dignified than texting, "Come over, no reason." It's considerably less dignified now that I can see the flaw in the plan. "Noted. Do you want to come in anyway?" I drove over. I'm not turning around now. We sat on her studio floor surrounded by fabric swatches, and somewhere in the middle of arguing about two nearly identical shades of gray, I realized I'd stopped tracking how much time had passed. By then, a fairly reliable indicator of how I felt about the person I was with. "You don't need an excuse," I said. "You can just tell me you want to see me." She considered that with the same care she brought to color selection. "Okay," she said finally. "I want to see you. No locked door required." Good. I prefer that version. The dinner Hannah had mentioned to Priya, the one that prompted the whole confrontation, happened on a Saturday 2 weeks into whatever we'd quietly become. I'd cooked at my apartment, nothing elaborate, and we'd ended up on the couch afterward with the specific, comfortable silence that develops once two people stop needing to fill every quiet moment with conversation. "I haven't done this in a while," Hannah said, looking at the room rather than at me. "Let someone see this much of an ordinary evening. Most of my relationships stayed fairly curated. Nice dinners out, careful presentation, very little of the boring domestic stuff." "Is this boring?" "No, that's what I'm trying to say badly. This is the opposite of boring, despite being objectively very ordinary. I made you watch me argue with a paint chip for 20 minutes last week, and you stayed anyway. The argument was compelling. You had strong opinions about undertones. I have strong opinions about everything. It's possible that's my actual personality rather than a professional quirk." She finally looked at me. "I think I'm letting you see the unedited version of me faster than I usually let anyone. I wanted you to know that, in case it wasn't obvious." "I noticed," I said. "I think I'm doing the same thing, honestly. I don't usually let people see me debug something live. It's not my most flattering process. Lots of muttering." "I'd like to see that, actually. The muttering. That's either a strange thing to be curious about or a sign you're genuinely interested in the boring parts." "Both," she said. "I contain both qualities. We've established this about me already." I laughed, and she leaned into my shoulder, and the evening continued in the specific, unremarkable way that good evenings do. Neither of us aware yet that Priya would learn about this exact dinner within the week and spiral accordingly. Priya found out about us on a Thursday, in the specific way that office gossip eventually surfaces regardless of how careful two people think they're being. She found me at my desk that afternoon with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not her usual chaotic enthusiasm, but something closer to genuine alarm. "Adrian," she said, "conference room, now." I followed her in, uncertain what specifically had triggered this, and she closed the door behind us with more force than the situation seemed to warrant. "Hannah told me," she said, "about you two, about the coffee and the lunches, and apparently a dinner last weekend that she described as going well, which from my sister is basically a declaration of marriage intent." "Okay," I said carefully, trying to read where this was going. "This is bad, Adrian." "Why is it bad?" "Because I dared you to do this." She was pacing now, the specific anxious energy of someone realizing the consequences of an impulsive decision several weeks too late. "I made a joke at a holiday party because I'd had wine and I thought it would be funny. And now my employee is dating my sister. And if this goes badly, if you two break up, I'm going to be stuck in the middle of it forever. Every team meeting is going to be awkward. Every family dinner is going to be awkward. I single-handedly created the most complicated possible version of this situation." I looked at her, genuinely startled by the depth of her panic over something I'd assumed she'd be delighted about. "Priya, breathe for a second." "I am breathing. I'm breathing very anxiously. You're not stuck in the middle of anything. Hannah and I aren't dating because you dared us to. We're dating because we like each other. The dare was just the accident that put us in the same room. What's happened since has had nothing to do with you." That's not how Hannah's framing it. She said, and I'm quoting, "This started because you cornered both of us into an awkward conversation," which sounds like blame to me. That's not blame. That's just an accurate description of how we met. People meet through accidents all the time. The accident isn't the relationship. Priya stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression that was working through something complicated. "What if it doesn't work out? What if I have to watch my sister go through a breakup and know I'm the reason she was even in that position? Hannah doesn't date casually, Adrian. She's careful about who she lets in, more careful than almost anyone I know. And if I accidentally manipulated her into a relationship that falls apart, I will have done real damage to someone I love over a joke I made because I'd had too much wine at a party. You didn't manipulate her into anything. She's an adult who made her own choice about whether to get coffee with me. I dared you. In front of her. At a work event. That's a form of pressure, even if neither of you registered it that way at the time. Priya, I want you to actually listen to what I'm about to say instead of just waiting for your turn to worry again. I held her gaze until she stopped pacing. Hannah is one of the most deliberate people I've ever met. She doesn't get steered into things she doesn't want. If she didn't want this, she would have said so within about 30 seconds of you cornering us at that party, and you know that about your own sister better than I do. Priya was quiet for a moment, some of the frantic energy receding slightly. She is stubborn, she admitted, spectacularly stubborn, actually. Our mother used to say Hannah decided what she wanted by age 4 and negotiations were closed after that. So doesn't it seem more likely that she's choosing this because she wants it, rather than because you accidentally pressured her into something she's been too polite to escape from for several weeks? What if it does work out? I said. Have you considered that outcome at all, or have you only been imagining the disaster scenario? She blinked, like the question genuinely hadn't occurred to her. No. I've mostly been imagining the disaster scenario. I'm good at imagining disaster scenarios. It's a skill that served me well as a startup founder and poorly as a sister. For what it's worth, I think it's working out. I think Hannah thinks so too, though you'd have to ask her directly rather than extrapolating from one sentence about how we met. Priya sat down slowly in one of the conference room chairs, some of the frantic energy draining out of her posture. I just don't want to have broken something. Either of you, or both of you, or the family dynamic, or your employment here. I have a lot of things I'm capable of breaking, apparently, when I get a glass of wine and a bad idea. You didn't break anything. You created an extremely awkward starting point that two adults navigated their way through into something that's actually working. That's not the same as breaking something. She looked at me for a long moment. You actually like her. This isn't just convenient or polite. I actually like her. Significantly. In ways that have surprised me, frankly, given how the whole thing started. Priya exhaled slowly, something settling in her expression that looked like relief finally arriving after a genuinely anxious stretch. Okay, she said. Okay, I'm going to stop spiraling now, but if this ends badly, I reserve the right to have fully predicted it. Understood. Full disclosure rights retained. Good. She stood, smoothing her blazer, recovering her usual composure with visible effort. For the record, I am thrilled. I was just also extremely panicked. Both things can be true. I'm learning that about you. I told Hannah about the conference room conversation that evening, over dinner at her apartment, the specific, casual intimacy of cooking together in a kitchen that had slowly become as familiar to me as my own. She panicked, Hannah said, unsurprised. That tracks. She does that. Big gesture first, consequences considered roughly 4 weeks later. She seemed genuinely worried she'd broken something, between us or between you two. Hannah set down the knife she'd been using on vegetables and looked at me directly. Can I tell you something I haven't said yet? Yeah, I asked her to do it. Hannah's voice was steady, but something underneath it suggested this admission had been waiting for the right moment. The dare. At the party. I'd noticed you a few times before that. You came to the summer office picnic, the one Priya makes everyone attend, and I was there helping set up, and we talked for maybe 10 minutes about nothing important. I thought about that conversation more than I expected to, for someone I'd talked to for 10 minutes. What did we even talk about? I genuinely don't remember the specifics. You were trying to fix the folding table leg that kept collapsing, and you'd gotten visibly frustrated with it in a way I found unexpectedly endearing. And when I offered to help, you said, and I'm quoting directly, I refuse to be defeated by furniture. Then you actually fixed it, with a flattened bottle cap wedged under the leg, which was simultaneously the most impractical and most charming engineering solution I'd ever witnessed. I don't remember saying that. I remember it precisely. I think about precise details for a living. It's sort of my whole professional skill set. She looked at the swatch in her hand, turning it slowly. I went home that night and told my roommate at the time that I'd met someone interesting at my sister's work picnic, which she found very funny, because apparently I don't usually come home from anything describing a person as interesting. So this has been going on longer than I realized. Months, technically. I just didn't do anything with the information for a long time, because doing something would have required directness. And I've already told you how I feel about that. I set down what I was holding. You set this up. Not exactly set up. I mentioned to Priya weeks before the holiday party that I'd met someone at the picnic who seemed interesting. And I might have mentioned your name when she pushed for details, and I might have known she'd eventually do something about that information because my sister cannot leave well enough alone when she thinks she's identified an opportunity to fix someone's life. Hannah went quiet for a moment. The kitchen sounded suddenly very small around us, the faucet dripping once, the refrigerator humming, nothing else. I asked her to choose you, she whispered. Not directly, not bravely, but I gave her your name because I wanted it to be you, and then I stepped back and let her do what she always does, because that felt safer than asking myself. I looked at her for a long moment, recalibrating an entire evening I'd thought I understood. So the dare wasn't really an accident. The dare was Priya's idea executed in Priya's chaotic way, but the reason she had your name to work with at all was because I put it there. Hannah picked the knife back up, though she didn't resume cutting, just held it like something to occupy her hands while she said the rest. I'm not good at directness, Adrian. I design rooms for a living because rooms don't require me to have difficult conversations about feelings. But I wanted you to know that what happened that night wasn't just Priya's chaos landing on both of us randomly. Some part of it was deliberate, mine. Why didn't you just ask me yourself, at the picnic or after? Because I am, demonstrably, not someone who does that. I carry a wood swatch to conversations so I don't have to make eye contact during the awkward parts. Directness isn't really in my skill set. She almost smiled. Priya, despite every chaotic and alarming quality she has, is extremely direct. I used that. I used my own sister's worst quality as a tool because it was the only tool I had access to that I trusted to actually work. I crossed the kitchen and took the knife from her hand, setting it safely on the counter, and held both her hands instead. I'm glad you used the tool, I said. Are you? Even though it means the whole thing was less of an accident and more of a quiet manipulation. I think quiet manipulation is a harsh way to describe wanting something and finding an indirect way to make it possible when the direct way felt too hard. I held her gaze. I do that too. Differently, but I do it. I kept fixing your office key situation longer than was strictly necessary because it gave me an excuse to see you. We're not so different in how we get to the things we want. Hannah's expression softened into something unguarded. I should probably tell Priya the truth, she said. That she didn't actually create this out of nowhere, that I planted it. You don't have to, but if you want to, I think it would help her stop spiraling about having broken something. She thinks she's responsible for an accident. It might help her to know it wasn't really an accident at all. Hannah considered this for a long moment, turning the wood swatch over in her fingers, a habit I'd come to recognize as her version of working through a decision. She's going to be unbearably smug about it, Hannah said. Once she knows. There's no version of this where she doesn't claim some kind of victory. Probably. But the alternative is her continuing to spiral about having broken something that was never broken to begin with. I think the smugness is the better trade. You're probably right. I hate when you're probably right. It happens occasionally. I try not to make it a habit. She set the swatch down on the counter, the decision apparently made. Okay. We tell her. Together, though I'm not doing this alone, and I'm definitely not doing it while she's mid-panic about something unrelated. We told Priya together the following week in the same conference room where she'd panicked about consequences she thought she'd caused. "So," Hannah said once we'd all sat down, "I have something to confess, and I need you to not make this weirder than it already is by being delighted about it." "I make no promises," Priya said. "The dare. At the holiday party, I orchestrated that, not the specific moment, but I gave you Adrian's name weeks before, knowing exactly what you'd do with it once you had it." Hannah glanced at me. "I asked her to choose him." "Indirectly, but I asked." Priya stared at her sister for a long moment, processing this information with visible effort. "You used me," she said finally, "as a delivery mechanism." "I used your specific brand of chaos as a delivery mechanism, yes. I have never been so proud and so annoyed simultaneously." Priya looked between the two of us. "So this isn't some accidental thing I created that I need to feel guilty about if it falls apart." "No," I said. "This isn't a dare anymore, and honestly, it stopped being one almost immediately. We're not here because of a bet you made over wine. We're here because we actually chose each other, and we wanted you to know that clearly, so you'd stop carrying around guilt for something that was never really yours to carry." Priya looked at both of us, something working behind her expression that eventually settled into a smile. "Okay," she said, "I'm retroactively taking full credit anyway, regardless of the actual mechanics." "That tracks," Hannah said. "That tracks completely." 6 months passed in the specific, unremarkable way good relationships tend to pass. Not without friction entirely, but without anything that felt like a real test. The kind of steady accumulation of shared routines and inside jokes that eventually stops feeling new and starts feeling like simply how life works now. Hannah moved her things into my apartment the following spring. The slow, unofficial migration that happens when two people stop pretending separate addresses makes sense. She kept her studio key on the same ring as her apartment key now, though she still occasionally texted that she'd forgotten something inside, more habit than necessity at this point. An excuse that had outlived its original purpose and become something else. Just a reason to hear from her in the middle of an ordinary day. She gave me a wood swatch on our first anniversary, framed, mounted on a small block she'd made herself in her studio. "White oak," she said, handing it to me. "The same one I always carried. I made a replacement for myself, but I wanted you to have the original." "Why?" "Because you're the reason I stopped needing it as a defense mechanism." She looked at the swatch in my hands. "I used to carry it so I had something to do with my hands when conversations got difficult. I haven't needed it once, talking to you since that first coffee. I thought you should have the thing I don't need with you anymore." I looked at the swatch, then at her, thinking about a holiday party dare that hadn't really been an accident, and a key that had become an excuse, and a small piece of wood that had quietly tracked an entire relationship without either of us noticing until it was over. The dare had been Priya's chaos, but the choice had been Hannah's all along. Priya hosted the anniversary dinner, naturally having appointed herself the unofficial historian of our relationship. The moment she'd learned her own role in it had been more deliberate than she'd realized. She raised a toast that managed to be both genuinely touching and insufferably self-congratulatory in roughly equal measure. "To the dare that wasn't really a dare," she said, glass raised, "which I take full credit for despite recently learning I was essentially a puppet in my own sister's scheme. I've decided this doesn't diminish my role. If anything, it proves my instincts were so good that Hannah had to engineer circumstances to access them." "That is not what happened," Hannah said. "That is exactly what happened. I'm choosing my own narrative and nobody can stop me." "Nobody's trying very hard to stop you," I said. "It's a generous narrative. Let her have it." Hannah shook her head, but she was smiling. The specific fond exasperation she reserved for her sister and, increasingly, for very little else. "Priya still thinks she's a romantic genius," I said. "Let her think that. It costs us nothing, and she'll bring it up at every family dinner for the rest of our lives regardless of what we tell her." "Worth it," I said, "for this." Hannah smiled, the unguarded real one, and outside our apartment the spring evening settled into the specific quiet of a Tuesday that had started ordinary and become, somewhere along the way, exactly where I wanted to be. What would you have done if your boss dared you into something as a joke, and it turned out the person on the other end had been the one quietly setting the whole thing in motion? Have you ever found out that the accident you thought brought you together was actually someone's deliberate, quiet choice? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.